Health outcomes. Changes due to interventions. To bring positive change, patient experiences and health must both improve. Healthcare costs must be lowered, and clinician and staff burnout has to end. But our problems are big. 133 million Americans have at least one chronic disease. 500,000 people are dying every year from hospital errors, injuries, and infection. The shortage of primary care professionals will be as much as 100,000 in just the next 5 years. Big problems require bigger solutions. Positive change needs acceleration. It needs to happen now. But these are not so easy solutions that many don't want to hear, and even few are willing to talk about. How to lead such a change? How to discover, discuss, and disrupt healthcare to make a difference now? This is VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. John Langell, the president of the Northeast Ohio Medical University. Welcome to VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action. VITALS provides a platform for an engaged discussion around how we can use value, innovation, technology, advocacy, leadership, and service as powerful tools to transform health and healthcare delivery. This evening, I'm excited to introduce our speaker and international healthcare leader and a NeoMed alumnus, Dr. Rajeev Venkayya. Dr. Venkayya is the president of Global Vaccine Business Unit at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, where he leads a vertically integrated business, developing vaccines for some of the world's most concerning infectious diseases. Dr. Venkayya serves as an independent member of the board, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and the International AIDS Initiative, and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as the director of vaccine delivery at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health Program, and served as the special assistant to the president for biodefense at the White House, where he oversaw U.S. preparedness for bioterrorism and biological threats, and was responsible for the development and implementation of the National Strategy for Pandemic Influenza. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Venkayya.
Thank you, Dr. Langell. It's great to see you and be with all of you today. I am honored to be invited to speak as part of this series. I understand that I'm the second speaker, which is a big deal for me. It's been a little while since I was at NeoMed. I came back in 2008 and had the privilege of giving the commencement address there. I'm sorry that this is virtual, but it's better than nothing. And actually, a lot has happened since the time I was at NeoMed that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. You know, I thought that a good way to approach today's topic is to go back in time to when I was in the White House, and that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to go ahead and open up my slides here, because what we learned back then, and which has held to be the case today, is that it doesn't just take science to address a biological threat. It takes strong leadership. And we've learned a lot of lessons around pandemic preparedness prior to the events of the past 10 months. We've learned even more since we've been in the midst of what the military might call a live fire drill, as we've navigated our way through the pandemic. And I wanted to talk a bit about the events that happened back then that alerted us to this threat and how we responded. I'll show a couple of, share a couple of vignettes related to that preparedness experience in the mid-2000s. Then I'm going to talk about our current response and how it has added to our understanding of what it takes to respond effectively to a pandemic. And then I'll switch gears and talk about science a bit. We'll discuss vaccine development and the rapid pace of innovation that we're in the midst of right now that hopefully will deliver a vaccine to us now. And finally, I'll talk about how we can ensure that those vaccines are available to everybody that needs them as soon as possible. So with that, let me begin with a little a little vignette about my time at the White House. I was in a biodefense role where I was working on a range of biological threats, from deliberate threats like an anthrax attack all the way through to pandemic influenza. In the 2004-2005 timeframe, the H5N1 avian influenza became a real concern in Asia because, excuse me, this flu virus had demonstrated the ability to jump from birds to humans with high lethality. Now, that is one of the hallmarks of a pandemic influenza virus, is the ability to cause significant disease in humans. And we were very concerned and watching for a second attribute, which is efficient human-to-human transmission. We hadn't seen that in Asia at the time, but we saw enough to make leaders around the world at the WHO concerned about the pandemic threat. And in the US, President Bush, who was a president at that time, took this very seriously after reading a book called The Great Influenza that described the 1918 Spanish flu experience, and decided that we needed to have a national strategy to address pandemic influenza. And this was a key learning for me, that health is not typically at the top of the agenda for leaders, for political leaders in particular. You usually see national security and even economic considerations to be at the top of that list. When a health threat, though, is near the top of the list, big things can happen. And in fact, once the decision was made to develop a strategy, we pulled together a team at the White House to develop not only the initial strategic approach, but also a 300-page playbook to address the pandemic. This is the kind of thing that you rarely see done for a health threat. But one of the most significant challenges that we faced from the outset is that we didn't have access, or we knew we wouldn't have access to a pandemic influenza vaccine for at least the first 6 months, probably more, after the pandemic was recognized. And herein lies a problem that has replicated itself today. We had to, in our planning, and today need to, get through the pandemic with the instruments at our disposal without a vaccine. Well, constraints unlock creativity. And as our team wrestled with the challenge of how do you shield or protect populations without a vaccine, we stumbled upon a couple of insights. One came from the disease modeling world, where an epidemiologist, disease modeler, actually he was more of a modeler who tackled this question of influenza transmission, found that partially effective interventions, if you put them together and implemented them in a coordinated way, might have a significant impact on reducing transmission in the community. That was a very important insight for us, because it opened the door to the possibility that if we planned properly and acted early in a pandemic, we might be able to change the shape of the curve. And this, in fact, is a graphic that you're looking at right now that reflects the outcome of that effort. We found that, at least through disease modeling, that we could potentially delay or slow the peak of virus transmission in a community. We could reduce the height of that peak, meaning that at the levels of greatest transmission, you have less of a burden on the healthcare system. And we could reduce the overall area under the curve by spreading the curve out, thereby reducing the number of people who become ill, are admitted to the hospital, and ultimately die. This is now called flattening the curve, but this curve that you see in front of us was actually developed in 2006, and we published it as part of our national guidance in 2007. Now, a key insight underpinning this was that point that I made about partially effective interventions. And back then, we explained it to people through a framework that had been developed for risk management called the Swiss cheese approach. Now, the Swiss cheese concept is that if you have a protective or mitigation measure that is imperfect, you can think about it like a slice of Swiss cheese. It has holes in it. It may be pretty good, but it's not perfect. But if you layer on multiple different types of interventions, each of which is imperfect, on top of each other, the slice covers holes in adjacent slices, and with enough layers in place, you can actually significantly reduce your risk. We applied this to disease transmission back in 2006, and we came up with this metaphor that we use to educate people about the value of imperfect interventions. Now, those of you that have been, if you're on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen the graphic that I'm about to show you, know that a lot has happened in Swiss cheese since we first came up with this framework. And this is a recent illustration that Ian McKay, who is at the University of Queensland, has put together that I think is just brilliant. What he has done is categorize interventions according to those that are within an individual's control, and then those that are a shared responsibility in the community, the things that we all need to work together to do in concert with each other. And we'll just go down the list here because I think it's important for everyone to know what constitutes a layer. So physical distancing is a layer. Everyone wearing masks can significantly reduce transmission in the community. That's a layer. Hygiene is a layer. Avoiding touching your face is a layer, and increasing physical distance in the communities, limiting your exposure into crowded spaces, as well as the time in those spaces, can reduce your risk. Beyond that, there is testing and tracing, effective ventilation, which is increasingly becoming a very important consideration in reducing risk. Of course, strong leadership and messaging. If somebody is sick, quarantining them and isolating them and quarantining the individuals that have been around them, and of course, masks. You can see that if this graphic works, that you actually have virus colliding with cheese, which is exactly what we want. We want the virus to be stopped in its transmission at some point down its journey through these layers. And this is a fundamental concept. Now, when I explain it like this, it may seem obvious to you that this is something that a strategy that we should deploy in communities. But the reality is that we've learned some hard lessons about this. We found that we haven't been very good about risk communication when it comes to this pandemic. And I think that this has played out in a number of areas that you'll all be aware of. For example, when we first saw the virus emerge in China, we were good about explaining where the virus was, but we were not good about explaining where we hadn't yet looked for the virus, but the virus might be. For example, in the US, when we were watching what was happening in Asia, very few people were talking about the possibility of those red dots, those outbreaks happening in the US without our awareness, because we weren't actually doing community surveillance for the virus. This is a critical gap in risk communication. Another one was around masks. Early on, we all know that the public health message from the WHO and others was that you shouldn't wear masks because we don't want to divert them from healthcare providers. We now recognize that if everybody wears a mask, you can control virus transmission at the source and significantly reduce transmission in the community. It's another layer. We are going to continue to learn lessons about risk communication, but to me, that is one of the key takeaways, both of what was done in 1918 when we saw that those leaders who were not effective in communicating the risk and what should be done saw poorer performance in their communities. We saw this difference between Philadelphia, where the leadership wasn't strong, and St. Louis, where the leadership was strong. The other area where we have not done a very good job is explaining that it's not a trade-off between implementing these measures to reduce transmission in the community and shutting down cities and the economy. That, unfortunately, has become a very political, polarizing issue, but it's a false dichotomy. It's not a choice. Many countries in the world have shown that if you can use these public health measures uniformly and effectively, you can reduce transmission to a level that allows business to be conducted, perhaps not normally, but close to normal, so that you can maintain the economy. And my hope, as we move into the fall and what could potentially be a very difficult season with COVID and perhaps influenza as well, is that we will actually internalize those lessons and be better about having the coordinated implementation of these public health measures, including universal masking across communities. Now, there are other things that we could talk about that relate to lessons learned, but that could occupy the rest of this talk and another week's worth of talks. So I'll save any more points about that until the Q&A. I want to move now to a couple of messages of hope, starting with vaccines. Now, you may know that in traditional vaccine development, it takes 10 to 15 years to bring a vaccine to the market. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Sorry. Okay. We're developing COVID vaccines at lightning speed. In fact, we believe that the first vaccines will be demonstrated to be effective and safe before the end of this calendar year for a virus that was just identified in January. That's an extraordinary acceleration in vaccine development. It's important for people to understand how we're doing that so that they have confidence that we haven't cut corners or made compromises in our safety and efficacy evaluations. This is a graphic from Florian Kramer recently in Nature. He's a virologist at Mount Sinai, who I think did a nice job of showing where we were shortening things. And I'm going to briefly talk about the top layer, where you can see the stages of vaccine development from the pre-human clinical trial work in animals to the vaccine manufacturing process development, to phases 1, 2, and 3 in sequence, followed by large-scale manufacturing, followed by the launch of a vaccine. All of that can take 10 to 15 years. If you look at the lower panel, you can see that one of the areas where we have reduced time is in the preclinical testing. Some of these vaccines had been tested against other targets in animals before, and we're relying on that toxicology and other animal studies rather than repeating them before going into human clinical studies in the cases of some of these COVID vaccine programs. When it comes to development itself, we typically do phases 1, 2, and 3 in sequence, and there may be many months or even years between each of those phases. In this case, we've done them on top of each other. We've been planning for phase 3 since we were in phase 1. At every step of the way, we have been assuming success, and we've not worried about financial investments. Governments have stepped in to fund the activities so that if the vaccine actually fails, if it turns out that your phase 2 if your phase 2 trial fails and you never needed to conduct a phase 3, the governments are saying that they will cover that risk for companies. And because of this sharing of risk, companies have been able to stack the planning for these trials on top of each other. Phase 3 is very important when it comes to vaccines, because here you are depending upon the epidemiology of the virus. If the virus isn't circulating, then you can't demonstrate with a vaccine that it is reducing the incidence in the vaccine arm relative to the placebo arm in a clinical trial. And so in the US, which I would say is probably the best example, Operation Warp Speed has set up sites across the country to ensure that they're able to enroll individuals in places where they know virus is circulating. What that does is it significantly reduces the time to accumulate cases in the study so that you can do an interim analysis that is what we call case-driven, sooner than you might have otherwise, and that in and of itself reduces the time to demonstrating efficacy. And then finally, we will have a couple of ways of provisionally or fully approving the vaccine that are faster than typically done. You've heard of emergency use authorization based on an initial limited set of data for selected populations, for the use in selected populations, followed by a licensure at some point after that, usually after more safety and in some cases efficacy data is collected. There are not major corners that are being cut here. However, there are some things that we're not going to know when we launch these first vaccines. We won't know how long they protect an individual. We won't know about the long-term safety profile. There are some other things we won't know, and it's going to be very important for us to follow individuals that have received the vaccines for months and years after they receive the vaccine to understand safety and efficacy fully and to be transparent with the public about the findings. We know that in the US, up to 50% of people are hesitant about taking a COVID vaccine when it becomes available. And so that is going to make it essential for us to be extremely forthcoming, proactive in our communication, and again, transparent about the data, whether it's good and bad, so that people can have confidence that that the vaccines are getting the appropriate oversight that they need before they're given to people. The last topic I'm going to cover is equity. Now, equity is something that you all know a lot about because you see the consequences of inequities in our health system every day when you see patients or work in a health system. The reality is that in the US, we have a multi-tiered system where a lot of people, or a portion of the population, because of social and economic determinants of health, they have poorer health and they have poorer access to healthcare. Once they get into the health system, they may not get the same quality of healthcare as others do. And those realities contribute to COVID driving a disproportionate burden of morbidity and mortality in certain populations in the US, particularly the Black and African American communities, as well as the Latinx populations in the US. These inequities have spurred the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services and vaccine manufacturers to ensure that they have underrepresented minorities in their clinical trials so that we can generate the necessary data to show that in certain populations that we have strong safety and efficacy data to support use in those populations. It also applies, of course, to older adults and other special populations. But the underserved populations are very, very important here as a strategy to address inequities. The other inequity, big one, that we expect to see in the world is in global access to vaccines when they become available. We know that countries that don't have financial resources may not have the ability to enter into deals with companies early to reserve supply of vaccines. On top of that, when there are so many vaccines in development, it's hard to know which one is going to be successful. And a country could easily bet on the wrong vaccine candidate. And at the end of the development program, if that candidate fails, they could be left with nothing. In order to address this, a global initiative called COVAX has been created, led by the World Health Organization, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and Gavi, which is a global institution that finances vaccines for poor countries. And they have created a financing and procurement mechanism that is primarily intended to address two big problems. The first one is to address the issue of uncertainty in vaccine development, such that for a country which can't decide which vaccine to bet on, they can commit resources to the COVAX facility and they will be guaranteed to get a vaccine that meets certain thresholds for safety and efficacy. They don't have to choose winners. On the other side is pooling of demand so that the COVAX facility can go to vaccine manufacturers and say to them that if you develop and successfully secure approval of a vaccine that meets certain criteria, we will purchase a certain amount of that vaccine for populations across all income strata of countries. Some countries that are self-paying for their own vaccine, other countries, low and middle income countries, where donor resources are going into the procurement of the vaccine. This is a mechanism that will not only help to address the risk for countries that want to get access to vaccines, it'll also directly address the issue of equity. And I'm very happy to say that as of today, nearly all countries have signed up in some shape or form to access vaccines through the COVAX facility. This has never happened in history. Well, we've never had a situation in history where every single country in the world wanted access to a health commodity in the same time frame. So that's a first. But we're meeting that challenge with another first, which is that we're making innovative health technologies, or at least we intend to make them available to all countries in the same time frame. The time frame is a critical element of equity here for obvious reasons. So while I talked about some challenges that we're facing in this pandemic and reflected on some of the lessons learned or not learned from planning that has been done in the past, I've hopefully given you some hope around vaccine development, as well as our potential to ensure that those vaccines, when they become available, get to everyone that needs and deserves them. And with that, I'm going to bring this to a close with a picture of one of my heroes, Tony Fauci. He's well known to all of you. He has been a hero of mine since I was in medical school, actually, at back then neo-UCOM. He's a person that has an extraordinary history in immunology and infectious diseases. In fact, I first came across him in the immunology arena, but then, of course, read about his work in HIV. And in every single outbreak of infectious disease that threatens big populations in the US, he has been there. He's an extraordinary individual. And I think, well, I'll say it again, he's a personal hero of mine. I had the opportunity when he visited Boston a few years ago to host him at our place for a fireside chat. And so that's where this comes from. So this is a good entree then to taking questions from the audience. And I'm happy to introduce Monica Robbins, who's joining us from WKYC, where she's the senior health correspondent. She's an expert at handling this kind of discussion. So Monica, let's take it away.
Dr. Venkayya, thank you so much. We have quite a few questions. For those of you who are interested in asking a question, I ask that you put it in the Q&A if you would, but I have some already. So I'm gonna start off with this one. You were actively involved in bioterrorism, and this person wants to ask you to comment as to whether or not there's any evidence COVID-19 was part of a bioterrorism effort.
So hang on just a sec. Let me ask one quick question. Are my slides still showing?
No, I don't think so.
And did you see the slide of Tony Fauci?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that did come up. Great. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that punchline made it over. So no, there is no evidence that the scientific community has seen that suggests that this was a deliberate threat. This has been examined by scientists around the world, and you can look at the genetic sequence of these agents, and you can also very clearly delineate viral evolution based on genetic mutations that you see in viral strains taken from the animal population, as well as people that were infected throughout the course of this epidemic. And there is no evidence that this was a deliberately engineered agent. Of course, it's a real question. It's a valid question to ask. It's an important question to answer, but we've seen no evidence that this was deliberately engineered as a threat against humans. We have, however, I mean, when I say we, I mean the royal community has found a lot of viruses that are similar to this coronavirus circulating in animal populations. And in fact, there are 50 different related viruses, bat coronaviruses, that we found in the wild, any of which could potentially in the future represent a crossover threat.
You touched on this for a second, but can you comment on whether or not COVID-19 has shown any signs of mutating since the very onset of the pandemic? And I'm curious to know, if so, how many times?
Yeah, we do see mutations in this virus. You see this happen in many viruses. The good news is that we haven't seen significant mutations in terms of numbers that raise concerns that any of these mutations, at least thus far, will allow the virus to escape, say, vaccine-mediated immunity or previous infection. We haven't seen that thus far, so that's the good news. This coronavirus does not appear, I mean, coronaviruses in general don't mutate the way we see influenza viruses mutate, which is why every year we need to have a new flu shot. We would not expect with this coronavirus that we would need to have a different vaccine, even if we do need to have boosters for the virus every year or a few years.
This question, do you know if companies are doing prenatal studies for COVID vaccinations? Will pregnant women be able to get the vaccine?
So to my knowledge, there are no studies in pregnant women yet, but this is certainly a high priority population. And I would expect the regulators like the FDA and companies to find a way to test vaccines in pregnant women in the future.
I can tell you, I just did a story on this, and Pfizer is going to start doing studies on pregnant women shortly, within the next couple of months.
That's typically the way this works, is that you start off with a general population, and you might have a subset in that population that is say a more vulnerable group, like older adults. So you get initial data that gives you a sense as to whether you have effectiveness in that population. And then you follow that up with more focused studies in those target populations.
This question says, I'm concerned that the general population is not getting appropriate preventative care, such as colonoscopy and mammograms. Very little has been done to educate the general population that they should not be afraid to get these tests. Also, the quarantine has led to an increase in deaths from overdose and increased alcoholism. Please comment on the downside of lockdowns.
There are too many downsides to lockdowns to count. I mean, it affects every single one of us, and some of us much more than others. And it's usually those who have the least resources to be able to deal with a lockdown. So clearly in this pandemic, we have seen a reduction in preventive health services, and we have seen an increase in mental illness. People who were already vulnerable to mental health issues or to chronic disease flares are having greater problems dealing with them during this pandemic. The issue here comes back to how we respond in communities to control transmission. The key challenge is reducing virus transmission in the community with coordinated public health interventions, and ideally those that are implemented early in an outbreak. And it is clear based on other countries' experience that you can suppress transmission of the virus in communities. And if you can do that, you can reopen. You can reopen your communities in a smart way. You can reopen schools in a smart way. And many countries have been able to do this months ago. And my hope is that we will get to a national strategy for how to, and a consistent approach for how to do this in all communities, so that once we suppress virus transmission in communities again, which might require a period of lockdown, by the way, in many places, because transmission is very much out of control in many parts of the country right now, that hopefully that'll be time limited, and we'll come out of it with a very smart way to maintain low levels of transmission over the longer term.
What we saw in the last lockdown, though, was grocery stores were still open, Home Depot was still open, those types of things. That's not the lockdown you're saying we need. We're talking nobody leave their house for 3 weeks.
Well, I think so. When you have this much virus transmission happening in a community, virus transmission is exponential. If you intervene early, then you can have a massive downstream impact on the number of cases that you have if you intervene early. If you intervene late, it's really, really hard to get things back in the box without something like a lockdown. And when I say lockdown, I do mean temporarily going back to what we did before, where in the beginning, where we had everybody basically staying at home, at least those that are able to. But that should be time limited to get things back to a level of control where you can, again, open up in a smart way. And one element of a smart approach is for everybody, 100% of people in a community, to wear masks. I mean, this is a very simple intervention. It's a minor inconvenience, but if you do it in public places, and even particularly in indoor environments where you may not have great ventilation during the winter and where you may have some crowding that is unavoidable, all of the most of the disease modeling suggests that this could have a huge impact on transmission.
Our next question, I wanted to ask what type of advantages and disadvantages current vaccine preclinical trials have, the mRNA-based protein subunit and adenovirus-based.
Yeah, so there are a few different types of vaccines that are in phase 3 clinical trials right now. The mRNA vaccines use RNA to insert RNA into cells, get RNA into cells to actually translate the RNA into protein that reflects the immunogen or the antigen that you want to develop a protective immune response to. There are 2 programs in phase 3 now, mRNA vaccine programs. There are also 2, at least in the US, vectored vaccine programs that are underway using adenovirus vectors. And there are also recombinant vaccine approaches that are in phase 3. Thus far, the data through phase 2 in all of the programs that are in phase 3 right now looks pretty good. It looks very promising. And so I do think that we have a good shot at more than one vaccine demonstrating efficacy and safety. Now, how long the protection lasts and to what extent we get protection, that's probably going to vary from vaccine to vaccine. But at this point, it's too early to say which vaccines are actually going to make it. But I'm pretty hopeful about everything that's in phase 3 right now.
We're seeing vaccines and antivirals and immunologic. Where do you see the actual answer for this particular virus falling into?
It's Monica. It's. I wish it were. We could place a bet on one, and that would solve our problems. But the reality is that we need a vaccine to control virus transmission. That's a must-have. Antivirals and monoclonal antibodies and other treatments have very important roles to play when we fail to prevent transmission and people end up in the hospital. Right now, we don't have any targeted therapies that are specific for COVID-19, and very few therapies have actually been shown to be effective once a person is hospitalized with the disease. The one that has had the greatest success is dexamethasone, so corticosteroids. But we know that corticosteroids have plenty of side effects, and there are downsides to using them in populations. And so we really do need targeted therapies. I think we need to have a very aggressive approach on multiple fronts, not just with vaccines, but also antivirals and monoclonals and other novel treatment approaches.
Stephen wants you to talk about your journey from Neomed to your leadership role in vaccine development at Takeda, and how does a graduate of rural medical university in Northeast Ohio that is very much community focused land such a key role at a pharmaceutical company?
Well, I don't consider Neomed to be rural. I certainly didn't consider it to be rural back then. I think that we all have inside of us certain motivations, things that are important to us that drive our career choices. And for me, I really loved physiology and physics, and that's what took me into pulmonary and critical care medicine. I had an interest in technology. That's what took me to San Francisco. But when I was in my fellowship, post-fellowship, I was restless. I enjoyed taking care of patients in the ICU, but I felt like I could have a greater impact in a different role. It's not that I didn't enjoy clinical medicine. I absolutely loved it. But the idea of affecting large populations through government policy was exciting to me. And so I went to DC as a White House fellow on a 1-year stint, which ended up becoming a 5-year stint and ended up in a role in the White House. But as with many things, my career wasn't planned out. I did, though, have clarity on what was important to me. And there were 3 things that were important to me that have carried me throughout my career. The first is that I wanted to have an impact at scale on many lives, if at all possible. And one can do that through public health and through government policy. The second is that I wanted to have my fingerprints on certain initiatives that had an impact. And I'm very honest with myself that at some level, this is driven by ego. It's a desire to connect yourself to an impact. And I was okay with that. So I wanted to be in a leadership role that would allow me to shape initiatives, programs that would affect many lives. And then I wanted to be able to have gainful employment so I could support my family in the future. And so those are the 3 things. That was the order of priority for me, by the way. I didn't come out saying I want to go out and just make a lot of money. I realized I needed to find a way to live, of course. So whatever I chose had to be sustainable. But the impact goal was really what drove all of my career choices.
Here's another one. What do you think the average price for a COVID vaccine will be coming up, and whether all who are down economically can afford that price?
Well, the price of the vaccines has been publicized for certain vaccines based on what some news releases have said that vaccines are being sold to governments for, and it's a range. It ranges from the mid single digits dollars per dose to upwards of $30, $40 per dose, depending upon the type of the vaccine and the company. So it's hard to predict where any particular country will fall in that range. It depends on a lot of things. But I have found that in many countries there is a commitment to make vaccines, to purchase vaccines by the government for a large portion of the population. So that in many places, I would expect vaccines to be made available free of charge. And there have been some public statements by the administration here that that's in fact their intent as well.
This person is wondering if you could address how difficult it is to properly fund or prepare ourselves from pandemics from a political perspective. and also dealing with how do we get bipartisan support for funding science and properly preparing?
It's really hard to get political leaders to pay attention to low probability, high consequence events, particularly infectious diseases. This has been a battle that has been fought for decades to get people to pay attention to outbreaks. What some people have done, and I did this when I was in government, is take the approach of quote unquote enlightened self-interest. If we can get the resources necessary to contain an outbreak, ideally an outbreak that begins somewhere else so that it never reaches the US, or if it reaches the US, to contain it while it's here, then that will be a good investment of time and resources. And there's been mixed success to that approach, mostly lack of success to that approach. My hope and expectation coming out of this pandemic is that people will realize that it may make sense to have pandemic specific investments like in vaccines and treatments. That'll be necessary to prepare us for the future. But the best thing we can do is to invest in our health system, invest in day-to-day healthcare, in our hospitals, in our public health system, because if those are functioning well in a food outbreak, an outbreak of foodborne disease in a community, then they're more likely to function well in the setting of a pandemic. Same with a mass casualty event. If we have good preparation to deal with disasters in small disasters in communities, and we do that uniformly across the country, we'll be better prepared to deal with a pandemic. So that's my hope, is that coming out of this, people's memory will be good, and that we will see investments in healthcare and public health follow.
If you were the person sitting in the Oval Office when we found out that this was happening in China, and you had the ability to make a policy or a plan, what would you have done?
I would have, well, let me say, I was in Davos on January, in the week of January 20th, when it was announced that China was building a 1,000 bed hospital in 6 days. And I happened to be with Richard Hatchett, who's the CEO of CEPI. And we were very, very concerned that week. And I can tell you that on January 23rd, CEPI announced investments in 3 vaccine programs for COVID-19, what's now called COVID-19. So as soon as actually from Switzerland, I called my wife and said, buy some masks because this thing is coming. Now we since donated those masks because healthcare workers needed them. We didn't hang on to them. But the point is that we knew enough about this respiratory pathogen to know that it was only a matter of time before it would be everywhere. When I got back to the US, we stopped all international travel on February 9th across the world, including in the US and in Europe, even though the virus was only in Asia. And on March 8th, we went to a global telework policy for our entire population, working office-based population around the world. And so what I would have done in the early days is I would have implemented a surveillance system in the US in communities, probably based on the existing flu surveillance platforms that we have, so that respiratory samples that were negative for flu, some portion of them would be tested for COVID. I would be doing sampling, taking blood samples from the population to see if antibodies to what's now called COVID-19 are emerging in communities, to start to give us a sense for how much virus is out there and an early warning. But the reason that would have been helpful to the country is that it would have put us all on alert that the virus was here. The problem I think we ran into was one of complacency, because frankly of not great risk communication in this. Again, we were all focused on where the red dots were on the map. We weren't talking about where the red dots were not. We weren't talking about the fact that we weren't looking for the virus in places we didn't expect it. And so that, I think, is the greatest lesson learned, is that surveillance in these situations is really important to give you early warning, and also to put everyone on notice that they need to get their response plans in place so that they can quickly take action to suppress transmission once the virus arrives in their communities.
Would you have stopped international travel sooner?
That's a tricky one. The traditional thinking about travel interruptions is that for a virus like this, they don't stop the virus from entering the country because there's so, and we now know, but it happens with flu also. You can have asymptomatic transmission. So it's really hard to really shut down your borders and keep the virus out. But it's not black and white. The reality is, if you stop travel or reduce travel, you probably will reduce the number of individuals coming into the country in the beginning, so you can slow the arrival of the first wave of the pandemic in communities, almost certainly. And if you use that time wisely to put in place your planning for the community-wide interventions to be implemented in a timely, coordinated way, then that is time well spent, and your travel restrictions may actually be worthwhile, but it really depends on how you use that time.
We hit another record in cases today, and we're just around the corner from 5,000 a day. And I'm guessing likely we're going to hit that. Your perspective, Ohio is still not quite as bad of a situation as some other states. But from your perspective, where do you see this going, and where do you see it finally leveling off?
I'm deeply, deeply concerned about where this is going in the U.S. But by the way, I should say that I've spoken to Governor DeWine on a few occasions throughout this pandemic. Amy Acton was a year ahead of me at near UCOM at the time. Although we didn't know each other that well, she and I have spoken a number of times when she was in her position at the Department of Health. And I have been very impressed with Governor DeWine's response. It has been proactive, it's been evidence-based, and he's curious. He's talking to all kinds of experts to try to get advice on better, smarter things we can do to control transmission. The challenge is that there hadn't been much transmission in rural communities. This is not just in Ohio, it's in many other states. And now it's come into rural communities, and it's becoming a big problem. And this comes back to the issue of public buy-in to the threat and our communication of risk. And unfortunately, we are in a situation where certain things have become quite political, like wearing masks. And I think until we get over this hump and have a single message for the country around things like testing and use of masks, we're going to continue to see a worsening pandemic. And my concern is that it's going to get worse through the winter months. But my hope is that now we're seeing the numbers where we are, that will push us to get to a true, well-coordinated national response, no matter what the outcome of the election is.
What other countries have been more successful in preventing COVID outbreaks? And I'll add to that, why?
Well, the countries that have been successful for different reasons. The ones that I would point to are places like South Korea and Taiwan, where they acted early. They had robust testing and contact tracing, so they were able to keep transmission at a very low level. At a low level of transmission, you can actually do contact tracing and what we call backward contact tracing, so that you find the source of the outbreak, which is often what we call a super spreader, and then you go forward from that individual to try to capture all the cases and put them in isolation, their contacts in quarantine. So I think a robust testing effort, a robust testing and tracing effort has been really valuable. In other countries, they have reduced travel and implemented screening at the borders early. Again, all of this works much better if you do it early. If you do it late, then these measures typically don't work. So in many parts of Africa, in fact, we have seen early action and very low levels of virus. Rwanda is a good example. Now you could say that the demographics in Rwanda are very different from the US, and of course that's true. It's a much younger population. But if you look at their test positivity rate, it's very, very low. They do lots of testing in Rwanda, and through their public health measures, they've been acting early. They've been able to keep this virus at bay. So there are other examples that I could share, but I want to, and I would encourage, by the way, people to look online. There are a number of articles that are starting to capture what other countries have done, because I think many of them have important lessons for us.
What's your advice to those who still think that it's a young person's illness and they're superhuman and they don't have to deal with it. And they still don't think that this is the crisis that it's becoming.
Well, the problem with that thinking is that it doesn't acknowledge what we can't see, and that is the people that will ultimately be harmed by our behaviors if we don't pay attention to this virus. It's absolutely true that that the vast majority of children and young adults are not going to have any problems dealing with this virus. Some of them do, by the way. We do see mortality, and we see a number of people with long-term sequelae, complications of COVID infection that can go on for many months. This is actually not that uncommon. But it's the bigger issue is that if you allow yourself to be a part of the chain of transmission rather than the end of that chain, then the virus will go on and it will eventually reach one or many people who are vulnerable. You can't point to those people and say who could be harmed through your actions, but they're out there. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating that importance of personal responsibility to people. So through stories. Yeah.
Can you predict a timeline for availability of a vaccine for COVID to the general public and the initial compliance and the consequences of a potentially relatively low vaccine interest?
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions about when vaccines will become available. I would expect that we'll have broad availability of the vaccine at the earliest in the middle of 2021 and probably the second half of 2021. And when I say broad availability, I mean general availability for the public. Priority groups, vulnerable populations, hopefully they'll get the vaccine in the first half of 2021, probably the second quarter. In terms of the vaccine hesitancy and uptake, I think that's understandable. People have questions about, as I said, what we're giving up with these rapid timelines and whether there is a safety risk that we haven't identified yet. I think the public's comfort will increase over time, particularly as we start rolling out the vaccines and get more and more follow-up and safety data. And as we have more and more examples of people that have received the vaccines and have been done perfectly fine, and that the vaccines actually work. So I think that'll take care of itself over time. In terms of how much coverage you need in order to have an impact, anything over 30% of a moderately effective vaccine, say a 70% vaccine, will help you. It'll help you to reduce the stringency of some of your public health measures. It's not going to allow you to stop everything and return to normal. In order to do that, you probably need closer to 70% efficacy, 70% uptake of a vaccine that is about 70% efficacious. That's a rough estimate.
What's more important right now, a mask or a vaccine?
Well, we need both. We need both. But since we don't have a vaccine right now, we need to wear masks.
It appears that the FDA is only looking for 50% efficacy. How will this affect the vaccine willingness? Is it adequate? And I'm going to throw in last year's flu vaccine. I think it was strain A, was only 35% effective and 50% effective.
That's a great point, Monica. So the FDA has set a floor to the vaccine efficacy. They've said it has to be at least 50% effective in order for it to be licensed. That doesn't mean that companies have engineered their vaccine to be 50% effective. Everybody wants to get as close to 100% protection as possible, and they try to do what they can to get there. But that's the floor, and so we just have to wait and see where the efficacy is going to land. Personally, I think that there's a reasonable chance that we'll see a vaccine in the 70% efficacy range. And I think, if it was anything better than 50% and licensed, I would be happy to take it for myself and for my family.
Are you still thinking that, plan on adding a COVID vaccine to your annual flu vaccine from here on out? Possibly.
We know that people can get coronavirus infections over and over. The same virus strain can infect them over and over. So natural immunity is not protective. It doesn't give durable protection. You oftentimes will see longer protection from a vaccine than you will get from a natural infection. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that longer protection. But I also am expecting that we'll need to have boosters, and whether those boosters are every year or every 2 or 3 years or more remains to be seen. We need to collect the data, and we'll probably see differences between vaccine types.
The common cold is a coronavirus, and we've never had a vaccine for that. Is this going to be something that eventually, maybe perhaps not immunity, but we will build a better immunologic response to it?
Possibly. In fact, a lot of people think that this will eventually become a circulating coronavirus that acts a lot like the common cold, because almost everybody has some level of cell-mediated immunity, as well as potentially some antibody-based immunity, so that you can still get infected, but you have a much milder profile of illness. So that's a very reasonable possibility for this virus in the future, over the long term.
What do you think is the most important lesson this pandemic has taught us?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of lessons that have been learned. I think in the U.S., I think the lesson has been around consistent, clear communication of a single set of messages to the entire country about both the risk and what people and their communities can do to protect themselves.
I think I'm going to end it with that. Is there any final points you would like to make to our audience?
Well, I would just say that this very, very difficult crisis that we're all going through is going to be transformative in many, many ways. It's going to change the way all of us think about infectious diseases and public health, and that's a good thing. I expect everybody, including decision makers, policymakers, to prioritize public health and medicine and science more than they have in the past as a result of this terrible set of events. I also believe that the extraordinary innovation that we have seen in vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics is going to carry over beyond this pandemic and give us an opportunity to actually develop treatments for the next pandemic before it happens. We can actually tackle coronaviruses. Now that we've seen SARS and MERS and now COVID-19, all coronaviruses threaten us over the past couple of decades. It makes a lot of sense to come up with a toolkit for coronaviruses across vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And I think if we can do that, we could potentially take coronaviruses off the table as a pandemic threat for the future. And I think that would be an extraordinary silver lining to this very, very difficult crisis that we are in.
Doctor, thank you so much for your insight. I learned so much in this, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to hand it back over to President Langle right now.
Thank you very much, Monica. And Monica, thank you for that outstanding moderation of this event.
Thank you.
Dr. Venkayya, you're an example of just what great impact a NeilMed graduate can have as a leader in this country. Thank you for an outstanding talk and an incredibly compelling message on an issue that is an ongoing international crisis. The topic of vaccine development and public health interventions in the middle of a global pandemic is both timely and relevant. The goals of VITALS is to inspire others to lead at all levels. And I know you have accomplished just that this evening. Thank you for the thoughtful conversation. And to the audience, thank you for asking some very difficult and important questions. Please join us next month. Oh, my apologies. Please join us next month for VITALS when we'll have Mr. Mark Paul, the president of Stryker Neurovascular, to discuss technology innovation in healthcare and how we can ensure the development of high-value solutions that won't break the bank. I challenge all of you to think about how you will play a role in leading important healthcare changes in the future. Be safe, wear your mask, and have a wonderful evening.
Health outcomes. Changes due to interventions. To bring positive change, patient experiences and health must both improve. Healthcare costs must be lowered, and clinician and staff burnout has to end. But our problems are big. 133 million Americans have at least one chronic disease. 500,000 people are dying every year from hospital errors, injuries, and infection. The shortage of primary care professionals will be as much as 100,000 in just the next 5 years. Big problems require bigger solutions. Positive change needs acceleration. It needs to happen now. But these are not so easy solutions that many don't want to hear, and even few are willing to talk about. How to lead such a change? How to discover, discuss, and disrupt healthcare to make a difference now? This is VITALS, Visionary Health Leadership in Action.